Hey everyone, and welcome back to another Ash Instructs video. Today we're going to be focusing on what are wavelengths. Well, wavelengths are a measurable property of EM radiation, right, or electromagnetic radiation. And the way they work, so if you look at this diagram right here, you can see that in this diagram we have a wave, and the distance between this point to this point is considered our wavelength. Now we see these labels that are labeled crest and trough. Now what are crests and troughs? Well, a crest is the top of a wave. So if we were to look at this wave right here, this would be the top of the wave, and a trough would be the bottom point of the wave. Now, if you look at the distance between this crest and this crest, that would be considered our wavelength. However, if I were to expand on this wave, let's just pretend that these are identical waves. But if I were to look at from this trough to this trough right here, this would be also considered one wavelength, right? This would also be considered one wavelength. And this would be identical. Now, we don't necessarily always have to measure a wavelength from a crest to a crest. As you can see here, technically the distance between any adjacent but otherwise identical parts of a wave are also considered a wavelength. So if we were to take this point right here and this point right here and draw a line between these two, this would also be the same amount as these two, and this would also be considered a wavelength. Moving on to the next slide right here. So let's just go a little bit more into detail of what wavelengths are. So the greater the wavelength, the lower the energy light has, right? So if we were to look at a high frequency wavelength, so if the wavelength for high frequency would be quite short. So if we were to look at from this crest to this crest and make a line in between to signify the wavelength, so a shorter wavelength would have a higher amount of energy, the same speed, and this would be an example of a UV light EM wave, and so this would be the example of a UV light wavelength. However, if we were to look at something for low frequency, the wavelength would be much longer. So if we were to look at these two crests and signify the wavelength in between here, as you can see, this is much more longer than the wavelength right here, and this would result in a lower amount of energy, the same amount of speed, and this would be for something like a radio wave. So just to recap, this would be something like a UV light, and this would be for something like a radio wave. As you can see, this one has a much shorter wavelength, and this one has a longer wavelength, resulting in a higher amount of energy on this side and a lower amount of energy on this side. So that's all for today's video. This is the simple kind of basics of what wavelengths are. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the comments, and I will see you in another video. Thank you so much. Bye.